Hello, my name is John Noguera. I am the Chief Technology Officer at SigmaXL. Welcome to our webinar, What's New in SigmaXL version 9.1, Part 1 of 3, Advanced Multiple Regression. Just a comment, our website is sigmaxl.com, and feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, John Noguera. Before we start, if you do have questions, please type them in. And at the 45-minute mark, I will review the questions and answer them. I won't be able to respond to the questions before that time. If you are having technical issues, please contact GoToWebinar, and their support team should be able to help you if you're having technical issues with audio or video or anything like that. And this webinar will be available for viewing. It takes a couple of weeks. We'll edit it a bit and upload it. So within a week to two, it will be available. And of course, part 2 and part 3 are the last Wednesday of every month. So in April and in May, we'll have part 2 and part 3. Oh, and also the PowerPoint will be made available. The dataset actually comes with the SigmaXL software, which I should also mention that the example that I'm going to do and all of the content actually is already in the workbook. So if there's anything that you want to go through on your own at your own pace, it's all given in as an example based on the customer satisfaction data example. All right, so let's start. We'll briefly introduce the new features and talk about some of the specifics, including goodness of fit and information criterion. These are all new metrics that are in version 9.1, such as, actually, I'm going to be covering some of the things that are already there, but these are the new things like AICC information criteria, Bayesian information criteria, MALO-CP condition number. Also new are the model validation statistics. And leave one out, cross-validation includes R-square predicted, and the PRESS statistic, which is the predicted residual error sum of squares. K-fold cross-validation, and so R-square K-fold, standard deviation K-fold, and then there's the train and test R-square and standard deviation. We'll also cover standardized continuous predictors, coding categorical predictors, application of Box-Cox transformation to the response, testing for regression assumptions and robust standard errors, and then we'll do the example that I mentioned from the customer data, overall satisfaction. We're also going to look at the ANOVA table for predictors and the Pareto charts that come from those ANOVA tables, the term generator that allow you to look at interactions in higher order terms. We have added mean effects and interaction plots, fitted means, contour and 3D surface plots, and the predicted response calculator with the optimize feature. And then we'll take Q&A, and that's at the Q2 mark. Also references, I'll just mention those briefly as needed. So typically, when you're building a regression model, the common approach is to look at the p-values, the term p-values, and if they are greater than 0.05 or 0.1, you take them out of the model. Sometimes you do that iteratively. And the thing is, what you end up with is a model that may be good, but not necessarily best. And so these new tools and metrics will help you to produce a model that is more optimal. So in this webinar series, we review metrics and methods that maximize the chance of building the best possible model with important terms kept in the model, unimportant terms removed from the model, and provide maximum prediction accuracy. Some of this is going to, for example, the automatic model selection will be in part 2. So due to time constraints, we won't be touching on that today. Formulas are presented, but they will not be discussed in any detail. And so we begin with what is called the residual sum of squares, and that's basically your observed minus your predicted value. You square that and you add it up, and that we call the RSS. That's residual sum of squares from which we get other metrics and other calculations, such as the standard error of the regression, which is the square root of RSS over the degrees of freedom. So n minus p is, n is the number of observations, and p is the number of terms in the model, including the constant. All right, so this is also known as the RMS error. Standard dev, or RMS error. R square is the percent variation in the response that is explained by the model, which is 1 minus RSS over the total sum of squares. And here's the total sum of squares, so it's the observed minus the mean squared added up. That gives you your percent variation explained. Now, R square by itself is a useful measure because it does give you a sense of how well the model explains the variation, but in terms of a metric to compare models, it's not very good because the more terms you put into the model, the higher R square will become. So one of the things that we have is R square adjusted, and that's 1 minus MSE over MS total. So there's a penalty for the number of terms in the model. All right, so it adjusts the R square with an additional penalty for terms in the model. So that's a better metric for model selection. However, even better yet are getting into the what is new are the information criteria. And so it's similar to R square adjusted in that it includes a penalty that is an increasing function of the number of estimated parameters, but it uses what's called the log likelihood function. And again, I'm not going to get into the formula details, but this is the ordinary least squares log likelihood function, and this is kind of the heart and soul of the information criteria measures. So you have Akaike's information criteria, AICC, which, by the way, we introduced in the forecasting, and so this is now in regular regression. I'm not going to get into the details. Basically, it uses the log likelihood function and formula to penalize for terms in the model. So the lower AICC, the better is the model fit. So when you're looking at a bunch of different models, the minimum AICC is the one that is preferred. So unlike R square, the standalone value, okay, so the one thing about AICC to note is that the number itself doesn't have a meaning, like R square, 0 to 100%, percent variation explained. And so the disadvantage of AICC is that it doesn't have that intuitive sense. It's just a number that you use for comparing when you're looking at a bunch of different models. But as a number, it's actually more powerful and does a better job of providing you with a model that gives you the best prediction accuracy. So it's generally recommended for model comparison, and it typically results in the model with the best out-of-sample prediction accuracy. So that's the one that we recommend for general use, is the Akaike information criteria corrected for small sample size, AICC. You also have the Bayesian information criterion. And again, I'm not going to get into the formula details. It also uses the log likelihood function. Smaller is better. It has a stronger penalty for extra terms in the model. So what that means practically is that you tend to get a more parsimonious model. And so it's more likely to be the true model. So there's really two aspects. One is prediction, and the other is explanatory model. And if you're interested more in an explanatory model, Bayesian information criteria tends to be the better choice. If you're interested in better prediction, AICC is the better choice. Now, having said that, it's really easy to do both, and then you can compare. It's just an option click and you rerun. In fact, I recommend that you do both and compare the models. So similar to AICC, the BIC number by itself is not meaningful. However, on a comparison basis where you're comparing several models, Bayesian information criteria, the minimum is the best model. Another one that's popular with some practitioners, but I'll be honest, I'm not really very fond of it, is MALO-CP. It's kind of similar to Akaike's information criteria, and it's harder to interpret. An unbiased model has the MALO-CP close to the number of model terms. So it's just a little harder to interpret. We include it in the stepwise reports, mainly for legacy purposes, for people who like to use this as a metric. But AICC and BIC are the metrics that we recommend. Okay, so that's MALO-CP. And oftentimes the optimal mallow CP will correspond to the optimum AICC, but not necessarily always. Condition number is kind of related to variance inflation factor, but it's just a single number. And if you have a large condition number, Montgomery says greater than 100, that indicates moderate multicollinearity. So you want condition number to be small, because what that's going to mean is that you're going to have better variance inflation numbers in the individual parameters. So that's another kind of overall metric that you can look at. Smaller is better. Smaller means less multicollinearity. And obviously, if it's a designed experiment, then your condition number is going to be 1. So, or an orthogonal design, I should say. If it's an orthogonal design, condition number will be 1. Okay, now we're switching gears a little bit. Model validation metrics. R-square predicted is also known as leave one out cross-validation. So what it does, basically, it goes through and each observation is removed. And the model is refitted, and then that observation that was removed is predicted. You have the observed minus the predicted, okay, and that gives you the press statistic. So you take the difference, square it, add it up, you get the press statistic. Now, computationally, there are tricks to doing this so that it doesn't take forever. And I'm not going to get into the details, but there's kind of some tricks that we use to quickly compute the press statistic. And R-square predicted is 1 minus press over total sum of squares. Very, very useful. This is produced with every model. There's no option. It will always, in the report, you will always see R-square predicted. So you look at R-square, you look at R-square adjusted, and you look at R-square predicted. And if the 3 are close, then that's pretty good, because that's effectively saying that the R-square is a good representation of what the model is able to do prediction-wise. And this is kind of the details, the technical details of how it's actually calculated. Uses what's the leverage. You might be familiar with that from the residuals, but I'm not going to get into the details. It's the hat matrix, the ith diagonal of the hat matrix. And that's how the press is actually calculated. It's just a lot more efficient than actually refitting the model with remove a data point and refit the model. Okay, so that's R-square predicted. Oh, and just a side note, for large samples asymptotically, press and the Akaike information criteria are equivalent. So that's kind of an interesting thing to know. At least theoretically, on a large sample basis, they are an equivalency. Now, there is something here I want to point out, and that is that R-square predicted, even with the efficiencies, it's still a lot slower to compute than AICC. So when we do best subsets, where every combination is considered, or we use a discrete optimization, it means that every time you have a candidate model, you have to compute R-square predicted. It's just too slow. And so because of that, R-square predicted is not available as an optimization metric. But once it uses AICC or BIC to select the best model, then it will report R-square predicted. Okay, so that's just a note. We also have cross-validation. And in cross-validation, the data are randomly partitioned into K, usually 10, subsets. So the model coefficients are then estimated using K minus 1, so 9 partitions. Or, again, if I'm using K of 10, that's going to mean that I'm going to be using 90% of the data for training and then the remaining 10% evaluation. And then we cycle through and do the other 9. So you actually get 10 models being built, and then for each one you compute the out-of-sample R-square, and then you compute the out-of-sample root RSS, residual sum of squares, and then you compute the R-square k-fold, which is basically just sum up the RSS values. Then that gives you R-square k-fold. So it's kind of similar to R-square predicted, but it's based on k-fold R-square. So it just gives you yet another means of validating. So this is, you also get a standard Dev k-fold, and k equals 10 is the default. Some practitioners prefer k equals 5. A technical note that if you do use k-fold cross-validation, It's strictly used to obtain k-fold R-square and a k-fold standard dev. The final model still uses all the data. Because it's based on a fixed seed that you specify, if you want, you can change the seed and rerun it and run it a few times to see what you get. So to just see how much variation you get on these metrics. So R-square predicted doesn't have any randomization. It basically removes each data point. R-square k-fold, there is a random component to it. So depending on the seed value there will be variation in that R-square statistic. It's also slow to compute, so is not available as a metric in best subsets. And best subsets, we won't really talk about that until the next webinar, but it is available in forward selection. And if you check it, the final model will show R-square k-fold. Thing you have to watch for is if you have categorical predictors, k-fold statistics, just depending on how the randomization works out. If you have training sample that does not include all of the levels, k-fold statistics cannot be computed. So it's not quite as robust as R-square predicted. Okay, so just again keep that in mind, that if you're not getting an R-square k-fold, it may well be that you have a categorical predictor with too many levels, or if you have categorical interactions, that starts to get a little bit tricky and kind of the luck of the draw whether you have a representative sample in your training set. With continuous predictors, that won't be a problem. Now, we also have train test. So it's kind of similar, but this is you provide a test ID column. So you have in sample, a training sample, and then an out of sample or a test sample. And the R-square test is computed on the out of sample. And similarly, the standard dev test is computed on the out of sample. So all the R-squares are interpreted the same way. 100% is ideal, 0 is bad. It's technically possible to have negative values for some of these. We will reset that to 0. Bottom line is that if you have a 0, it means the model's not doing a very good job in predicting out of sample. Okay, and that's something that might come up, so keep that in mind. For example, if you have a saturated model, R-square is always 100%. But then R-square adjusted shows up as cannot be computed, and then R-square test, R-square predicted, these will all be zeros as well. Train test, use that only if you have a large data set. All right, this is kind of getting into big data. If you have less than 1,000, it's probably not a good idea to be doing the train test split. You can, but there's a lot of, if you take 30%, you have a lot of variation. Cross-validation is really a better choice for, say, small to medium data sets. And then you can create a test ID column manually using the Excel rand function. And this just shows you how to do it. We're not going to do this in this webinar, but I'm just mentioning if you need a random column of 0, 1 values where 30% you have zeros denote the training data, so 70% would be zeros and 30% approximately would be ones. So that formula can be used. Also, R-square test is not available as a criteria to optimize. The R-square test is really intended to be a pure final sanity check where the data, the out-of-sample data, is not touched in any way for any part of the model building process. Cross-validation is okay, we're using it there, but for train test split, the way we do it here, it's just standalone. You take the training data, you build your model, and then you compare against the out-of-sample test data. So it's blind, it's a true blind test. If you have continuous predictors, so we're switching gears a bit, and you standardize, you can subtract the mean, divide by the standard dev. This is really important if you're including interaction terms or higher order terms. That dramatically reduces the multicollinearity VIF scores. And also your predictors will be scaled to the same units. So it's kind of like the idea from a DOE designed experiment where you code the predictors. But here, if you just have historical data, you subtract the mean, divide by the standard dev, you're converting them to z-scores. Okay, and we will be doing that. And then the other option is that if you do have a DOE, you can code to ±1. All right, so if you have a full or fractional factorial design, then you'll want to use this coding option rather than the standardize option. You can also code for categorical predictors. 1,0 is the standard dummy coding, with the hidden reference value is the first alphanumerically sorted level. Or you can code for categorical predictors as -1, 0, +1. So this is new. We've always done this, but this is a new option in 9.1. So for example, if you have a DOE with categorical predictors, you may want to use this -1, 0, +1 coding scheme. We won't be looking at that today. We do have now Box-Cox transformation, which is useful for, let's say your residuals show unequal variance across the predicted values, then Box-Cox transformation is a good way to stabilize the variance. You can have rounded lambda or optimal lambda. So this is applying Box-Cox on the residuals, and it solves for the optimal lambda. All right, so again, that just depending on the model, you can try Box-Cox and see if there's an improvement in the fit. That's one possible outcome. Or if you have a problem with non-constant variance, Box-Cox transformation is one technique that will help you to address that. Now, we also test for constant variance. This is new, and this is somewhat unique to SigmaXL, is an actual test for constant variance. So the idea is kind of like when you're doing an ANOVA, we do have tests for constant variance. We have Bartlett and Levine. And then if the variance is unequal, you use a Welch ANOVA. So in regression, what we do is that if the variances are not constant and Box-Cox doesn't work, then there is what's called white robust standard errors. Okay, so that actually modifies the standard errors so that they are robust to non-constant variance. Also, the same thing when you're testing for autocorrelation. If your final model have significant autocorrelation, then you can use the Newey West robust standard errors. So basically, you just uncheck assume constant variance, no autocorrelation, and it will automatically apply the correct adjustment to the standard errors. So we're ready to begin the example, and we are going to look at the overall satisfaction. I'll start with some slides, and then we'll move over into the demo. So here, if you've used SigmaXL, you're very familiar with our example of overall satisfaction. And here we have overall satisfaction versus responsive to calls. Good, strong relationship. The more responsive we are to calls, the higher is the level of customer satisfaction. And here we have overall satisfaction versus ease of communications. Again, a good, strong, positive relationship. Customer satisfaction survey is on a 1 to 5 score, where 1 is very dissatisfied, 5 is very satisfied, and survey results were averaged to obtain non-integer results. When you look at a categorical predictor, which is the customer type, we see using the box plots that customer type 2 has a higher satisfaction score, higher median than customer types 1 or 3. So those are the 3 predictors that we're going to consider: responsive to calls, ease of communications, and customer type. And so now I'll switch over. I'm looking at the customer data. And so we go to statistical tools. We go to advanced multiple regression, fit multiple regression model. So this is the new content in 9.1. We also have the multiple response optimization, which we'll talk about in the 3rd webinar. So I'm going to select overall satisfaction as my Y. I'm going to put responsive to calls, ease of communications as my continuous predictors, customer type as my categorical predictor. I'm going to standardize the continuous predictors. I'm going to leave the coding for categorical with the default, dummy coding 1,0. I'm going to turn on main effects plots and interaction plots. I'm not going to use Box-Cox transformation. If I check advanced options, I'm also not going to use stepwise. That we'll cover in the 2nd webinar. We're going to assume constant variance. We do want to see the term ANOVA sum of squares and the Pareto charts. I will turn on the k-fold cross-validation. This is not used pseudo-standard error. This is only for DOEs that are unreplicated. So basically, the advanced regression can be used to analyze unreplicated DOEs. So that's length pseudo-standard error, which is already in SigmaXL, but we wanted to add it to the generic regression tool. All right, so I click OK. I click Next. And when I do that, I come up with this dialog. And in this dialog, I can specify main effect plus two-way interactions, main effect plus two-way interactions plus quadratic, main effect plus all interactions, and all up to three-way. For now, I'm just going to use main effects, and then I'll come back and I'll add the interaction terms. So I'll just select all and then click OK. So I want to start with kind of the simplest model, which is the main effects, which is the responsive to calls, ease of communications, and customer type. So we have a good R-square, 90.58, a good R-square adjusted, 90.18, and a good R-square predicted. So you look at those percentages, they look pretty decent. And you look over here on the cross-validation, it's a little bit lower, but it's still quite good, 88%. Naturally, one of the things we want to do is see if we can make some improvements on the model by including interaction terms. The responsive and ease are all significant. Now, the hidden reference value is customer type 1. And so we see that 1 versus 2 is significant, but 1 versus 3 is not significant. Now, over here in the ANOVA for predictors table, we see responsive again is significant. It's actually the same p-value. Ease of communication also is the same p-value as up here. But here, this is an overall p-value for customer type, the categorical. And it's not at the 0.05, but it's still below 0.1. So we'll tentatively leave it in the model for now. Some practitioners prefer 0.05 and some prefer 0.1, but for our purposes, we will keep this in the model. Durbin-Watson, nothing is significant, so no autocorrelation. Test for constant variance, the overall test is 0.1, so that's not significant, but it's interesting, we do have responsive to calls as a possible contributor to non-constant variance. Now, I want to point out this should only be used on the final model, because as you take terms in and out, as you make changes to your model, it's possible that this test for constant variance, both Durbin-Watson and Rush-Pagan, can change as the model changes. So you really want to, don't get too concerned about it until you actually are at that final model. And the same applies to Box-Cox transformation. I wouldn't apply Box-Cox until I got to the very end, and only if necessary, because of course it adds a level of complication to the model if you're transforming the response. As I mentioned, AICC, BIC are here. These numbers are not really useful other than when they are used in comparison, and we'll be using those in the next webinar when we do forward selection and best subsets regression. Now, let me talk about the Pareto charts. So this Pareto chart uses R square, so term R square. So it kind of gives you a nice, obviously, X1, so let me scroll over here. Responsive to calls is the dominant contributor to variation in overall satisfaction, followed by ease of communications. So that's one camera angle or one Pareto chart. The other is the Pareto chart of standardized effects. The standardized effects come from the p-values, so they're converted into standardized effects. So you get a nice visual display. And you also have your significance line. So here we see, again, this is using the 0.05, so the customer type is below the line, which means it is not significant at the 0.05 level, but the other two are. This, of course, becomes more useful with more terms, with only 3 terms in the model. You don't need it quite so much, but I just wanted to keep it simple for explanation purposes. I also want to explain the difference between type 1 and type 3. Technically, when you're doing R square, you really should use type 1 because that is sequential sum of squares. And when you use type 1, these will add up to the R square value, the overall R square value. when you're using type 3, these do not add up to the overall R-square, unless it's an orthogonal design, DOE. So having said that, though, I think it's still useful to include this, and that's why we include the term R-square for either type 3 or type 1, and when in the options you can select either or both. In fact, you can have 4 Pareto charts displayed. So this kind of, again, gives you a good idea of what's important in the model. And then our predicted response calculator, this is the same as what we had in the previous version, but what's new is the fact that you can now, rather than having to use the dummy coding 01, you can actually change your customer type option here and use that in the predicted response. So categorical predictors are now presented as a combo dropdown. Also, you don't have to use solver to maximize. You can just click maximize and then run optimize. And then here we get our optimal value, responsive to calls 5, ease of communications 5, customer type 2, predicted response is 4.87, and then we can produce contour surface plots. So then we have nice visual demonstration of increase in customer satisfaction with increased responsive to calls and increased ease of communication. Okay, so again, this was previously just in designed experiments, is now integrated into the regression. Also, the plots, these are the main effects plots. So you can see the larger slope for responsive to calls, followed by ease of communication, and the relatively small contribution for the categorical customer type. Now, the interaction plots are demonstrated, but because they're not in the model, they're displayed, but they're grayed out. And obviously, the lines will be parallel because you don't have an interaction term in the model, and these are fitted means. These are not data means, okay? So that's another important thing in our DOE. They're data means, whereas here, these are all fitted means. Now, what I am going to do now is I'm going to rebuild the model, actually just a quick look at residuals, and you can see they don't look very good. So let's see what we can do to possibly, it looks like there's something, there's definitely not just random variation in the residuals, and let's see what we can do to improve the model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do recall SigmaXL, and then I'm going to keep everything else the same. All the options are the same. But now I'm going to go next, and I'm going to change it to main effects plus two-way interactions. So remember, we standardized, so we don't have to worry about multicollinearity due to units. So now we'll run the model with the additional interaction terms. So now we have, so our R-square went up quite a bit. It is interesting that it does appear that the X1, X2 interaction is significant now. So customer type is not significant, but this responsive to call by ease of communications is significant. So let me just quickly go back and refit the model. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all. I'm only going to look at responsive, ease, and responsive by ease. So I'm basically taking customer type out altogether. So just left with this simpler model. And okay, so R-square predicted has improved. R-square has gone down a little bit, but R-square predicted has gone up. So that's a good thing. We're seeing a better R-square predicted. We're seeing a better R-square tenfold. Everything is significant. And the residuals, while not perfect, okay, and this is where maybe we could do a Box-Cox transformation, but it's definitely an improvement in the model. So this is our final model, and we can look at the plots here. This is, again, our interaction plots, our mean effects. It's a simpler model, so it's easier to interpret, and it does quite well. Actually, you know what? Let me show you, let me just do one more thing here, because the Bush-Pagan test for constant variance is showing up as significant. So let me run Box-Cox on this, just to show you what happens there. So I'm going to go with the same model. I've turned BoxCox on, and now basically the non-constant variance is gone, and we've got an even further improvement on the R-square. What we did was we squared the y. The lambda is 2. So the disadvantage is now it's a little bit harder to interpret the formula because it's all basically you're taking the square root. And this, by the way, this formula is an Excel formula or can be used. Also, this formula is an Excel formula, so you can actually save it and use it elsewhere. These underscores are converted, blanks are converted to underscores, so you have legal range names. So it just gives you a little more portability. Okay, so I'm looking at the time now, and I basically hit on the main points that I wanted to for today's webinar. We pretty well covered everything. I know it was a short time, so hit along on everything. So I'm going to now open it up to questions. Okay, so James said, very good. Residuals analysis revisit, often not enough focus. James, I'm sorry, that was one thing. I didn't spend a lot of time on residuals because there's really nothing new in 9.1. That residual analysis and the things like leverage and so forth, influence, were part of the earlier version. So I'm just focusing really on what's new. And again, response surface option and regression models, very useful for communicating model-driven causal analysis. So thank you. That's really the goal here, is to turn this into kind of a more powerful regression tool. So a lot of the power of DOE. Now, again, you do have to pay attention to your variance inflation factors. You know, if you've got crazy VIFs, and by the way, if they're really extreme, we automatically kick them out. And then you'll get a report at the bottom of stuff that was kicked out. Notice it also says parameter estimates, model summary, information criteria, validation, test statistics, and residuals are for the BoxCox transformed response. So there is the advantage of BoxCox transformation is that you might get a better model, but it's a little bit harder to explain. So you kind of, you know, it's a mixed bag on that one. But anyways, that's I did that because I had the non-constant variance and showing you that BoxCox can be a solution. Okay, Carlos, also in type 1 sequence, the first predictor will show higher R-square. Yes, thank you for pointing that out, because type 1 sequential is very dependent on the order. So the only real advantage to type 1 sequential is the fact that the R-squares sum up to the overall. When you look at the R-square values, they sum up to the overall R-square, or the sum of squares sum up. And that's why type 3 is the default. Adjusted sum of squares is the default. So the only thing is then that for type 3, technically, you know, this doesn't add up to R square, so it's kind of a negative, but I think it's still a useful diagnostic. All right, giving you in terms of a overall contribution visual, as well as the actual p-value based standardized effects. So while I'm waiting for other questions, also I want to mention that what we did was we added under the help, what graphical tool should I use and what statistical tool should I use? And this is in the workbook, but people often aren't aware of it. So we have a nice summary table, summary of SigmaXL graphical tools, what tool, what it is, what type of data, when to use, and where it is in SigmaXL. Okay, so that's just, I just wanted to mention that. And also, what statistical tool should I use? We have a summary, SigmaXL statistical tools. So on just a one-page PDF summary, just kind of giving you like the overview of all of the tools. So I'm open to any other questions. Okay, can the comparison of type 2, well, we don't have type 2 sum of squares. Carlos is asking, can the comparison of type 1 and type 2 coefficients detect collinearity? Your detection of collinearity is here in the VIF. So you want a VIF less than 5, and the tolerance is 1 over the VIF. So that's what you want to use for detection of collinearity. And if you're doing the best subsets, you also get the condition number. Okay, sorry, type 3. Carlos, I'm not. I mean, you're right. Collinearity will definitely make a difference. So I hear what you're saying. If you have collinearity, in fact, if you have orthogonality, the two are the same. And if you see a big difference, then that's going to be an indicator that you do have multicollinearity. But in terms of diagnostics for multicollinearity, I would use the VIF. But that's a good point. In a highly multicollinear situation, there might be big differences between type 1 and type 3. So something to keep in mind. And you got to be careful. Look, if you have high VIFs, all right, so we automatically kick it out if it's very, very high. But you may, in your process, if you've got very high multicollinearity, you really need to be thinking about kicking stuff out, because effectively, you've got indicators that are essentially the same information as being provided. So make your decision and simplify your model. Anything else? Okay, thank you, James. Oh, let me just to point out a couple of other odds and ends. So what we do, because one of the things that can happen when you start running recall SigmaXL dialog and refitting, every time it creates a new set of sheets. So we automatically number. So you'll see MREG1, MREG1, MREG1. So that's a group associated with your first model. Okay, so there's your residuals and there's your plots. And then MREG2, that was your second fit. And the residuals for MREG2. And the plots for MREG2. This is the contour plots associated with the first model. So you look at the number, and that tells you which, that's kind of your keeping things organized for you. You can rename the sheets, but if you're quickly going through and cranking out multiple models, trying different things out, like trying different terms in and out, then just keep that in mind. First of all, it can grow quickly. We do not support multiple responses for model building. You can only select one response at a time, but we do allow multiple response optimization. You just basically have to build each model separately. And we think that's a better approach anyways. You focus on each response as a separate model. When you have your final models, then you put it all together in your multiple response optimization. And that's what we'll talk about in our third webinar. Here are the references. Draper and Smith is a kind of a classic textbook on regression, applied regression analysis. This is a classic, but it is somewhat outdated, but I can't not mention it. This is what I sunk my teeth into in the early days of regression. This book is newer, Fox, Applied Regression Analysis. It's more advanced, and it includes advanced topics such as the White and Newey West robust standard errors. This is a really good book. Jim Frost, a really good introductory book, and it's concise and inexpensive. So I include this as a kind of a nice starter if you're not familiar with regression. And this is probably, if you had to pick one, I would go with Montgomery, Introduction to Linear Regression Analysis. Okay, so it's an intermediate level book. I love everything from Doug Montgomery, whether it's time series or SPC or DOE or regression. His books are always really good. And I just remembered one more thing I want to mention, and I want to show you what happens. Uncheck box Cox. And what I want to do is I want to show you what happens if you uncheck assume constant variance. All right, so if we do that, what happens, and I'm going to keep the model simple. So the fact that we had non-constant variance, then the white robust standard errors kick in. And what that means is that these standard errors will be slightly different. Okay, so in the end, it means the p-values might change. So it doesn't really affect things that much. The coefficients do not change. Okay, this is not like weighted least squares. Weighted least squares, the thing I don't like about it and why we don't include it is that it's not consistent with regular regression. As soon as you apply weights, you get different coefficients. The beauty of this methodology is that it modifies the standard errors to accommodate for the non-constant variance. So it's a very nice technique. The white robust errors, and the details are in the appendices. Now, we went with the Box-Cox transformation. This solution was to rerun it with the, if you didn't want to use Box-Cox, and there are reasons to not use it because it does complicate the model more, then you can go with this white robust standard errors. Or if there's autocorrelation, it will use the Nui West standard errors. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that as well. And let me just see if there are any other questions. And I think that's it. Okay. Thank you all very much for your participation. I appreciate the questions and your comments. So I'll close it now and hopefully see you all a month from now. And actually the schedule for that is here. So this is part 2 of 3, Wednesday, April the 27th at 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Okay, thank you all.